As we approach the 30th anniversary to the original Donkey Kong Country, my favorite video game ever made, I wanted to talk about something that this game does incredibly well, and that's the atmosphere. There's something very special about the atmosphere of Donkey Kong Country. Beneath the obvious colorful visuals and the music and the cartoonish characters, there lies, at least to me, an unexpected layer of isolation. A kind of beautiful loneliness that wraps the game in an aura of quiet wonder. It's a feeling that lingers in your mind long after you've put the controller down, as if the world of Donkey Kong Island continues to exist without you. Let's take a moment to explore this unique atmosphere and what makes it resonate with me so deeply. From the moment that you start up the game, you're dropped into a world that feels vast, untamed, and empty. Donkey Kong Island is a place of extremes. Lush jungles filled with distant bird calls, silent caves illuminated only by flickering torches, and icy mountain peaks where the only sound is the howling wind. And despite the vivid environments, there's an overwhelming sense that this island does not revolve around Donkey Kong or you. The world feels alive, but indifferent. You're not saving a kingdom or rescuing a princess. You're just trying to reclaim what's yours, navigating a landscape that seems unconcerned with your mission. David Wise's iconic soundtrack is a very important part of Donkey Kong Country's emotional depth. The music doesn't just accompany the gameplay, but it often tells a story of its own. Aquatic Ambience's serene, ethereal feeling encompasses drifting alone in an endless ocean. Its gentle melodies evoke both beauty and vulnerability, as if you're a small creature lost in a vast, uncaring sea. The mechanical, pulsing rhythm of Fear Factory underscores the stark contrast between nature and industry. It's cold, it's impersonal, and it's a reminder of the encroaching Kremling influence. And though Stickerbush Symphony is technically from the sequel, it is still very much thematically linked. It's a hauntingly beautiful piece that lingers in the memory of players, evoking both sadness and peace. The music often feels more reflective than triumphant, emphasizing the loneliness of this adventure. One of the most striking things about Donkey Kong Country is how it uses its environments to tell a story. The jungle is full of life, but that life feels very distant. The birds fly overhead and insects buzz in the background, but none of that interacts with you. You're just passing through. And the dark, echoing caves feel ancient, like they've existed for centuries before you arrived, and will continue long after you're gone. And the biting cold and desolate landscapes of the snowfields create a sense of isolation that's almost palpable. The snow falls steadily, indifferent to your presence. And each level feels like a snapshot of a living, breathing world, but one that doesn't necessarily acknowledge you. It's as if the island itself is a silent observer, watching your journey without comment and without interaction. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong may have each other, but that quest often feels solitary. The Kongs are the only ones fighting to reclaim the Banana Horde. Funky Kong and Cranky Kong often provide brief moments of interaction and comic relief, but for most of the adventure, you are alone. Unlike many platformers of this era, there are no villages, there are no towns, or bustling NPCs to fill this world with chatter. The only allies that you encounter are the animal buddies, and even they feel like more part of the wilderness than true companions. The absence of a larger narrative or external pressure gives the journey a very personal quality. You're not saving the world, you're not saving the galaxy or even a kingdom, you're just fighting for what matters to you. And this simplicity makes the loneliness feel profound rather than bleak. A recurring theme in Donkey Kong Country is the clash between the natural beauty of the island and the harsh industrial presence of the Kremlings. The jungles, coral reefs, and mountaintops are vibrant and full of life, but they also feel very fragile, very breakable. The Kremling's intrusion threatens to upset that delicate balance, and the factory levels are stark and cold and unwelcoming, filled with grinding machinery and toxic hazards. They're a reminder that the Kong's world isn't untouched. It's being invaded, and it's being reshaped by something cold and without feeling. This tension just adds to that beautiful loneliness. It's not just about physical isolation, but also about the emotional weight of watching something beautiful be corrupted. Something very special and almost exclusive to Donkey Kong Country is how it gives you space to breathe. The game isn't afraid of silence. There's no timer at the top right of your screen telling you that you only have a certain amount of time to complete a level. Between the action-packed levels and challenging platforming sections, there are moments where you can simply take in the atmosphere and the music. Sometimes you'll find yourself pausing to admire the way the jungle sways in the breeze, or the way the water glimmers in the coral reefs. Unlike many modern games, Donkey Kong Country doesn't bombard you with constant dialogue, cutscenes, objectives, tutorials, etc. It gives you the freedom to reflect on the journey and immerse yourself in this world. These quiet moments make the loneliness feel beautiful rather than overwhelming or oppressive. This game is a journey that will stay with you. It's very simple. It's a very simple game, but the beautiful loneliness of the original Donkey Kong Country is what makes it timeless. It's a game that doesn't just challenge your reflexes. It's not an easy game, but it speaks to something deeper. It's about being small in a very big world, finding meaning in solitude, and about appreciating the beauty of a place that feels untouched by our greedy human hands. Even after you've defeated King K. Rool and reclaimed the Banana Horde, the memory of that lonely, beautiful journey remains fresh in your mind. You can almost hear the distant echoes of aquatic ambience or feel the chill of the snowfields as you think back on your adventure, and in that moment, you realize that Donkey Kong Country, it was never just a game. It was truly an experience. There's something truly magical about Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Conquest. It's not just the tight gameplay or the visuals, it's the feeling of it all. From the moment the title screen fades in, you know that you're in for something different, something deeper than your typical platformer. This is not a game about hopping around happy jungles or collecting shiny objects just for the sake of it. No, this is a true adventure. One where you're stepping into dangerous, unfamiliar territory, and every level feels like a test of your courage and your wits. What makes the atmosphere of this game so unforgettable is the way that it balances excitement and unease. It feels like you've wandered into a world that doesn't necessarily belong to you. A world that's wild, unpredictable, mysterious, and maybe even a little haunted. And yet, it pulls you in. The promise of discovery, of uncovering secrets and overcoming challenges is just too strong to ignore. Right from the start, DKC 2 sets the stage for something darker and more dangerous than the first game, while also weirdly being more lighthearted and more playful. You're not on Donkey Kong Island anymore. You're in Crocodile Isle, deep in the heart of Kremling territory. The opening level, Gangplank Galleon, immediately gives off an eerie vibe. The pirate ship that you're on, it creaks under your feet, the mist hangs heavy in the air, and you can almost feel the eyes of the Kremlings watching you from the shadows. It's thrilling, but it's also extremely unsettling, like you've wandered into a place you're not supposed to be. And that is the tone of essentially the whole game. Crocodile Isle doesn't feel like a world built for you. It feels like a place with its own history and its own rules. The Kremlings dominate every corner. From the murky swamps to the crumbling temples, this is not your home. It's theirs. The world feels alive in DKC 2, but also very hostile. The environments are some of the most memorable in all of gaming. They're not just backdrops, they feel like living, breathing places with endless stories to tell. Take the swamp levels for just an example. The water, the insects, the trees, all of it combines to create a space that feels ancient and dangerous with so much history. Or the bramble levels with their sharp, tangled vines and hauntingly serene music, we'll get to that momentarily. They're beautiful, but they're also so intimidating, like they're daring you to step out of line and just see what happens. Every single level feels distinct, but they all share that same sense of adventure. The world of Donkey Kong Country 2 feels very layered, like there's always something just out of reach. Maybe a secret path, maybe a hidden treasure, or maybe a story you'll never quite fully understand. David Wise's soundtrack is everything. Not only does it complement the game, it literally defines it. Each track is so perfectly matched to its environment that it's hard to imagine the levels without them. In fact, I would say it's impossible to imagine the levels without them. Stickerbush Symphony is the standout, of course. It's calming and beautiful, but there's a sadness to it too, like you're wandering through a place that's been forgotten by time and you want to reach back to those maybe nostalgic memories, but you just can't. And then there's Mining Melancholy with its relentless rhythm that feels like a heartbeat in the dark, echoing depths throughout the mines, and Forest Interlude, which is just as impactful as Stickerbush Symphony to me. It's peaceful, almost meditative, but it carries an undertone of danger, reminding you that throughout this adventure, you're never truly safe. And the music doesn't just set the tone, but it pulls you deeper into the adventure and immerses you in a way that hardly any other games do for me. It makes you feel the weight of every jump, every climb, and every close call you may have. One of the coolest things about this game is the way that you move through Crocodile Isle. You start at the bottom, where the first game ends, on Gangplank Galleon and in the swamps and shipwrecks, and you work your way up through increasingly dangerous terrain. By the time you're climbing the rigging of a massive galleon or navigating the fiery depths of a literal volcano, it feels like you have earned this. You have earned the right to be here, and you have earned your progress. And then there's that final push. The ascent to the Flying Croc. It's not just another level, it's the culmination of everything that you have been through up to this point. The stakes feel sky high, quite literally, and the game makes sure that you know it. And there's something really charming about Diddy and Dixie Kong as the main characters this time around. I've talked about before how it's kind of bothered me a little bit that Donkey Kong is only the main character in one of the 3 original trilogy games when it's called Donkey Kong Country, but I've made that point known, it is what it is. Diddy and Dixie are not big, strong heroes like Donkey Kong, they're much smaller, they're scrappier, and they feel like underdogs, and they are, quite literally, children. Diddy, stepping out of Donkey Kong's shadow, has this determination that's pretty much impossible not to root for. And Dixie, with her helicopter hair and her attitude and the way that she carries herself, feels like the perfect partner for this kind of adventure. It's just fun, and together they're not just fighting for Donkey Kong trying to save him, they're trying to prove themselves and prove that they can handle whatever the Kremlings throw at them, and they do. What makes this game so addictive is the balance between danger and discovery. Every level in DKC 2 feels like a risk, but the rewards make it all worth it. The bonus barrels and hidden rooms feel like little treasures waiting to be found. They're not handed to you, you have to earn them. And when you do, it feels incredible, like you've uncovered something that no one else has seen. Even the animal buddies added a sense of adventure. They were underutilized, in my opinion, in the first game, but here they really do stand out. Rambi smashing through the enemies, Squitter weaving webs, and reaching those areas that were just out of reach. They're not just helpful, but they make you feel sort of unstoppable in a way, even though it's only for a moment. What sets Donkey Kong Country 2 apart from other platformers is how it mixes excitement with a subtle sadness. The world is beautiful, yes, but it's also decaying. The bramble levels are stunning, sure, but they feel lonely in a sense, kind of like the first game. Even the Kremling's pirate antics carry a sense of desperation, like they're clinging to something that they've already lost. It's not a depressing game by any means, and I think it's much more lighthearted than the first game is, but there is an emotional depth to it that makes the adventure feel more meaningful. You're not just running and jumping, you're exploring a world that feels alive and complicated. You're not trying to get your banana horde back, you're trying to get your friend back. When you think back on Donkey Kong Country 2, it's not just the gameplay or the graphics that will likely stick with you. It's that feeling. The thrill of stepping into a dangerous, unfamiliar world. The quiet beauty of the brambles, the pulse of the music driving you forward. It's the kind of game that leaves an impression long after you've put the controller down, much like the first game did. It makes you feel like you've been on a real, true adventure. One that's just as exciting as it is mysterious, and as beautiful as it is dangerous. And that is what makes Diddy's Conquest more than just a sequel. It is a game that feels alive, challenging, and truly unforgettable. Do you ever have that place in your mind that feels like it's real even though you've never been there? A place that's not just part of a game or a story, but something much bigger. Something you can almost feel if you close your eyes. That is what the Northern Hemisphere is to a lot of people. It's not just a setting, it's like this living, breathing place that's tucked away in people's imaginations. A wild, hectic world where the rivers never stop flowing, the trees stretch so high they disappear into the sky, and there's always a secret waiting just out of view. And sure, that probably sounds dramatic for a almost 30-year-old 16-bit platformer, but honestly, DKC 3 deserves it. It is my least favorite out of the original trilogy, but it still deserves all the praise. The game isn't just about running, jumping, blah blah blah, though don't get me wrong, there's plenty of that too. It's about the adventure and just the vibes of it, much like the second game. The sense that you're stepping into a world that's much bigger than you are, with mysteries to uncover and dangers at pretty much every turn. And so here we are, Dixie Kong, fearless and determined, and Kiddy Kong, who, let's face it, it looks like he should be in a daycare somewhere rather than on this quest. They're not exactly an obvious duo like Diddy and Dixie were, but they work for the most part. There's something endearing about the way that Dixie takes the lead, flipping through the air with her ponytail while Kiddy barrels through obstacles like an excited toddler. Together, they're exploring this massive wilderness to find Donkey and Diddy, who have gone missing again. But really, the search is just an excuse to dive headfirst into this sprawling, mysterious world. One of the best things this game does is it has an actual overworld that you can go, like it's much different than the first two games, because in the first two games you were just going from point A to point B. But this is part of the journey. You're not just selecting levels, you're steering this little motorboat through rivers, dodging rocks, and trying to figure out how to get to that one spot that's just out of reach. And the thing is, the map feels like a place. It's not linear. There are secret paths and side areas, places where you can dock your boat and find something unexpected, maybe a hidden cave or a cabin that belongs to the Brothers Bear, or even just a hint about something bigger. But it's the kind of map that makes you slow down and look at it, wondering what you might have missed. And the levels, honestly, they're really good. Each level feels like a little snapshot of this world. Like take Lake Orangutanga, for example. It's just a lake at face value, but the way that the sunlight glints off the water with the mountains in the background and the way the music makes you feel like you're out on a lazy summer afternoon, I think it's great. It's so peaceful that you almost forget that there are enemies waiting to knock you into the water. And then you've got places like Kremwood Forest. You're climbing these massive trees with the sunlight barely breaking through the leaves, and everything just feels so still. It's quiet, almost reverent, like the forest is alive and it's watching you. You can almost smell the damp moss and hear the creak of the branches underneath your feet. But just when you think you have the game figured out, it throws something like Riverside Race at you. I remember actually the first time that I played it, I didn't know that it was timed. So I'm just playing the game normally, taking my time, wandering along, and then suddenly there's a big clock ticking down on the screen and I failed. Next thing I know, I'm doing it again, dodging dragonflies, leaping over gaps at Mach 3, and just praying that I make it to the end. It's chaotic, but in a really great way, and those timed gimmicks and other gimmicks in the game don't ever overstay their welcome. The underwater levels this time around, I really enjoy them. A lot of people, for very good reason, don't love underwater levels in games, particularly in games like Mario, where, don't get me wrong, I love 2D Mario games, but the DKC games are obviously a lot more inventive when it comes to the platforming, the backgrounds, the environments, etc. And these water levels are some of the most beautiful and the most unsettling. The way that the light filters through the water, and with the music shifting to something softer, it's almost haunting, and it reminded me a lot of aquatic ambience from the first game. But there's always a tension, like you're not supposed to be there. Again, just much like in the second game, because you were invading Crocodile Isle trying to get Donkey Kong back. Maybe it's a giant fish lurking just off screen or the sudden spike traps, but it definitely keeps you on the edge in the best way possible. And then there are the bosses, my favorite bosses in the entire Donkey Kong Country franchise. They are not just obstacles, they are not just beads that you have to hit with a barrel a couple times, they're not just a beaver that you have to jump on 3 times, they're events. Chaos, this hulking robot, feels like something out of a science fiction movie with sparks flying everywhere and gears grinding. And then there's Barbos, this enormous underwater creature that you have to outmaneuver while it tries to skewer you, and doing that on SNES controls is rather challenging. Each boss feels very unique, very fresh, and like it belongs to this world, and beating them always feels like you have earned it. So obviously, the vibes in Donkey Kong Country 3 are there, and they work very well. I think this game is criminally underrated, and like I said, while it is my least favorite out of the original trilogy, I do like it more than Returns. Not as much as Tropical Freeze, but I definitely like this one more than Returns. But it's just, if I ever want to play a Donkey Kong Country game for the vibes, it's Donkey Kong Country 3 that I end up playing. And the music by Evelyn Fisher, Evelyn Novakovic at the time, she really does a great job. I haven't really given her the due that she deserves with my past couple videos. She did help out David Wise a bit in the first and second game. I think mostly in the first, but I know she did a bit in the second game, and she was the lead composer this time around, and I really think she does a great job. Again, I don't think most of it quite lives up to what David Wise had proceeded with, which that is an incredibly high bar, so I'm not going to hold it against her. She does a great job, and a lot of these tracks I find myself whistling pretty much on the daily. It's a great OST, and it deserves the praise. At the end of the day, the real magic to me of Donkey Kong Country 3 isn't the levels or the bosses or even the secrets. It's just the way that it makes you feel. It feels like you've been somewhere, like you've been on vacation that takes a turn. Like you've stepped into this wild, beautiful world that's bigger than you are, full of places to explore and mysteries to uncover. It's the kind of game that doesn't just stick in your memory, it settles into your bones. Even years later, I can close my eyes and see the rivers, the forests, the mountains, the backdrops in this game, like with the mountains and everything, climbing the cliffs. It's so well done, and I'm glad that finally, within, the Nintendo sphere, people are slowly starting to give this game the credit that it deserves, because it really is, like I said in my original DKC 3 video essay, it is a perfectly adequate finale to this trilogy. It is a great game. So if you ever get the chance, if you own it originally on the SNES, or if you somehow have it on a virtual console of a past gaming system, or if you have Nintendo Switch Online on your Switch, go ahead and play it. You will not be disappointed, especially if you're a 2D platformer fan, a platformer fan in general, or you're a fan of Nintendo, or a Donkey Kong Country fan, because this game is a great Donkey Kong Country game. So, if you ever get the chance, play it, regardless of the means. But don't rush through it. Take your time, much like in the first two games. Go ahead, take your time and take everything in. Wander a little bit. Let yourself get lost in the vastness of the Northern Hemisphere. Because games like this don't come around super often. This trilogy, I have said for years, is a lot deeper than people give it credit for, and I might occasionally be grasping at straws, but games like this don't come around very often, as we've seen, especially since the game came out. They're not just about finishing the story, they're about adventure and the vibes that they give off and the way that they make you feel. It's the kind of game that stays with you long after you're done with it. The levels are great, the art design is great, the music is great, Dixie Kong is awesome, Kiddy Kong is okay. I know a lot of people like him, I know obviously a lot of people despise him. This game is just very good, and I think you should try it out if you haven't. And like I said before, this game and the trilogy as a whole is a lot more than just running and jumping through levels. It's not just about the thrill of the journey, but the pull to keep exploring, even when the story is over.
He's the beast you loved on Super NES. And now we've captured him on Game Boy, in an all-new game with all new enemies and worlds. Donkey Kong Land. New for Game Boy and Super Game Boy.
The Donkey Kong Land trilogy is one of those fascinating chapters in gaming history that often tends to get overlooked. Though it will forever live in the shadow of its SNES big brother, there's something undeniably charming about these little handheld adventures. They exist in a space that feels experimental, scrappy, and at times bold. Rare wasn't just porting the magic of Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy, they were reinterpreting it, squeezing a full-fledged console experience into an underpowered black and white 8-bit handheld. It's a story of technical ambition and creative constraint, and it's worth taking the time to unpack. But before we dive into this trilogy, I want to set the stage. It's the mid-1990s, and we are in the golden age for Donkey Kong. After spending most of the 80s as an arcade relic, the big monkey was reborn in 1994 with Donkey Kong Country. But the game wasn't just successful, it was truly a phenomenon. Rare's use of pre-rendered 3D graphics set a new standard for what video games could look like, and the gameplay was no slouch either. It's easy to imagine Nintendo executives at the time looking at Donkey Kong Country's runaway success and thinking, how can we bring this to our massively popular Game Boy? But of course, the Game Boy wasn't exactly a powerhouse. Compared to the Super Nintendo, it was a relic even in its heyday. It lacked color, had a tiny resolution, and relied on a processor that could generously be described as basic. And yet, Rare was up to the challenge. They took the spirit of Donkey Kong Country, its platforming, its aesthetics, its tone, and reimagined it for the handheld. That reimagining is the heart of Donkey Kong Land. These games aren't just ports, they're something a lot more interesting. I want to talk about each title in turn and talk about what makes them different from their Super Nintendo counterparts and what makes them very much the same. Because they tell a story not just of Donkey Kong, but of what happens when creative people take creative risks. The first game in the trilogy feels like Rare testing the waters, both technically and conceptually. Released in 1995, it came hot on the heels of Donkey Kong Country's massive success. But this was not just a stripped-down version of the Super Nintendo game. It was a brand new adventure, complete with its own story and level design. The story is a classic Rare tale. Cranky Kong, ever the skeptic, claims that the success of Donkey Kong Country was just because it had great graphics, and so to prove him wrong, Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong set out to show that they can star in a great game even without those cutting-edge visuals. It's a very clever and meta setup that immediately endears you to the game. It's very self-aware, poking fun at itself while also acknowledging the limitations that the Game Boy had. From a gameplay experience, Donkey Kong Land is very much in the vein of Donkey Kong Country. You run, you jump, you roll into enemies, and you blast out of barrels, but there are definitely key differences here. The levels are shorter, and the levels are simpler, which makes sense given the Game Boy's more casual pick-up-and-play audience. The controls are a bit floatier than they are on the SNES, which definitely takes some getting used to, but they are definitely functional. And then there's the visual presentation. Rare worked miracles with the Game Boy's hardware, delivering still pre-rendered sprites that look astonishingly close to their Super Nintendo counterparts, though the lack of color can definitely make things hard to see and difficult to read at some parts. But what really stands out about Donkey Kong Land is its personality. Rare didn't just copy and paste environments from Donkey Kong Country. Sure, there's the jungle and the underwater levels, but there are also completely new locales, like a surreal cloud world and a massive underwater city. These choices give the game an offbeat charm, as if Rare was saying, if we can't wow you with graphics, we're going to surprise you with creativity. And then there's the music. David Wise deserves a medal for what he accomplished on the Game Boy. He stripped down to chiptune form. Tracks like Gangplank Galleon and Fear Factory still carry the emotional weight, and there's something hauntingly beautiful about hearing these lush compositions reinterpreted through the lens of limited hardware. Moving on to Donkey Kong Land 2, the second entry in the trilogy, is where things really start to feel more refined and polished. Released in 1996, Donkey Kong Land 2 is heavily based on Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Kong Quest. It's not quite an exact port, but it's very close. You've got the pirate theme, the darker tone, and the return of Dixie Kong as a playable character, but like I said, this is not quite an exact port. Rare adapted and condensed the experience to fit the Game Boy's strengths. One of the first things that you'll notice about Donkey Kong Land 2 is how much smoother it feels compared to its predecessor. It feels much better. The controls are tighter, you feel less floaty, and the camera follows you much closer and doesn't wander off a bit when you jump too high or go too low. Rare obviously learned a lot from their first outing. The controls are tighter, the graphics are a bit clearer, and the level design feels more focused. This time, the levels aren't just shorter versions of their SNES counterparts, they are sometimes reimagined in ways that make sense for the Game Boy's smaller screen and much slower pacing. The music once again steals the show. Grant Kirkhope, this was actually Grant Kirkhope's first job at Rare. He was the one responsible for Donkey Kong Land 2, taking the music from DKC2, converting it and condensing it to fit on the Game Boy. Tracks like Stickerbush Symphony lose none of their emotional resonance, even in this simplified form. It's a true testament to not only David Wise's genius, but also Grant Kirkhope's genius, that these melodies can survive such a dramatic downgrade in fidelity and still hit you right in the feels. The story, this time, pretty much mirrors Donkey Kong Country 2's very closely. Diddy and Dixie are on a mission to rescue Donkey Kong from Captain K. Rool. It's a straightforward setup, but it's perfect for a handheld game. You can pick it up, play through a few levels, and feel like you've made meaningful progress. And while the game leans heavily on its Super Nintendo counterpart, it still finds moments to surprise you, like with its inventive boss battles and occasional new twists on familiar mechanics. By the time Donkey Kong Land 3 had come out, the Game Boy was entering its twilight years. The Super Nintendo was still going strong, and the N64 was ushering in a new era of advanced 3D gaming. But Rare wasn't quite done with the handheld just yet. In fact, in my opinion, they saved the best for last. Donkey Kong Land 3 feels like the most polished by far and the most ambitious game in this trilogy. This time, the story focuses on Dixie Kong and her cousin Kiddy Kong, mirroring the setup of Donkey Kong Country 3, but, once again, Rare reimagined the experience rather than simply shrinking it down. The levels are brand new, with a stronger emphasis on exploration and secrets. What really sets this game apart is its sense of scale. The environments feel bigger, the level design is more intricate, and the overall difficulty is noticeably higher. Rare was clearly pushing the Game Boy to its absolute limits with this one, and it definitely shows. The visuals look a bit crisper, the animations are smoother, and the game, it just feels more confident overall, like they finally had it mastered this third time around, although I still do enjoy the first one, and I quite love the second one. And of course, obviously, the music is fantastic. Evelyn Fisher's score still sounds great even on the Game Boy. The rich, layered composition still sounded great on the Game Boy sound chip. There's a sense of almost finality to the soundtrack, as if it's saying goodbye to this era. So, what is the legacy of the Donkey Kong Land trilogy? I want to ask you guys. What do you think? On the surface, these games might seem like just lesser versions of the Donkey Kong Country series, but that's a pretty shallow reading. These games aren't about recreating the console experience. They're about adapting it, rethinking it, and making it work within the constraints of this incredibly underpowered handheld. In a way, the trilogy kind of represents a kind of creative purity. Rare absolutely could have played it safe, but they didn't. They embraced the challenge of the Game Boy and used its limitations as a canvas for innovation. The result is a series of games that feel scrappy, inventive, and oddly personal. Even today, on the heels of Donkey Kong Land 1 and 2 finally making their way onto Nintendo Switch Online within mere days of one another, the Donkey Kong Land trilogy stands as a testament to what can happen when talented developers think outside the box. They're not perfect games, but they don't need to be. They're artifacts of a time when gaming was more willing to take risks, more willing to experiment, and more able to surprise us. And in a medium that often chases perfection, that is definitely something worth celebrating. There's something pretty awesome about the return of a beloved franchise. A sense of warmth and nostalgia mixed with cautious optimism. For many, Donkey Kong Country Returns was just that. A reimagining of a classic series, it brought one of Nintendo's most iconic characters back to the spotlight. But, as is often the case with beloved properties, its revival wasn't universally praised. Some felt the game hit all of the right notes, while others, not so much. I wanted to dive headfirst into this game and talk about why this game is celebrated by so many, and why for others, it didn't quite capture the magic they were hoping for. Let's start with the love, because honestly, there is a lot to love about this game. When the game was first announced, it felt like a homecoming. The Donkey Kong Country series on the Super Nintendo was not just another platformer. Rare's use of pre-rendered 3D graphics pushed the boundaries of what games could look like in the 90s. The music, everything about the games just worked. Fast forward to 2010, and the franchise had been dormant for well over a decade. Retro Studios, the team that had already proven themselves with Metroid Prime, was handed the reins. The result? A game that felt very familiar, yet fresh, respectful of its roots, and unafraid to chart new territory. One of the first things that hits you when you boot up Returns is how alive it feels. The art direction takes the lush jungles, precarious cliffs, and spooky caves of the originals and injects them with vibrant energy. The levels are not just static backdrops, they breathe. They move, the leaves flutter, the platforms crumble beneath your feet, and the enemies interact with the environment in ways that make the world feel dynamic. The silhouette levels deserve special mention here. These stages strip away the game's colorful palette, leaving only the outlines of characters and objects against richly hued backgrounds. It's bold, artistic, and a beautiful reminder that Retro Studios was not just remaking the original Donkey Kong Country. This was a sequel, and they were reinventing it. And then there's the gameplay. Retro Studios nailed that sense of momentum that defines a great Donkey Kong experience. Every roll, every jump, every swing feels deliberate and satisfying. The levels are designed with precision, challenging players to master their timing and their reflexes. But here's the thing. Donkey Kong Country Returns isn't just about reaching the end of a level. It's about doing it with style, with panache, with finesse. Collecting every Kong letter, finding all of the puzzle pieces, and conquering the fiendishly difficult time trials are badges of honor for players who crave a good challenge. The return of the minecart levels was another highlight, for better or worse. These high-speed, nerve-wracking stages are synonymous with Donkey Kong Country, and Returns pushes them to the absolute limit. One moment you're jumping over gaps, the next you're upside down on a loop-de-loop, all the while the track disintegrates beneath you. Thrilling? Absolutely. Frustrating? Well, we'll get to that. No discussion of Donkey Kong Country Returns is complete without talking about the music. The original trilogy set an impossibly high bar, thanks to David Wise and Evelyn Fisher's legendary compositions. And while Wise and Fisher are absent this time around, the team at Retro Studios, led by Kenji Yamamoto, managed to strike a delicate balance between honoring the classics and introducing new themes. Hearing remixes of tracks like Sticker Bush Symphony and Fear Factory is like meeting an old friend who's changed just enough to keep things interesting. The music isn't just background noise. It is a crucial part of the experience here, pulling you deeper into the game's world. So if Donkey Kong Country Returns has all of this going for it, why isn't it universally adored? Let's get into those reasons because they are well worth exploring as well. For many players, myself included, the biggest sticking point was the controls. The Wii's motion controls were a hallmark of the system, obviously, but they were not universally loved, especially in a game that is as precise as Donkey Kong Country Returns. To roll, a move that you have to use constantly, you had to shake the Wii remote. This might not sound like a big deal, but in practice, it added a very large layer of imprecision to a game that demands perfection. Imagine losing a life because your shake didn't register properly during a crucial jump. It's infuriating, especially when the original Super Nintendo games had such tight, responsive controls. I understand for games like Wii Sports, you obviously need to move around for games like that, but the very least they could have done was make the motion controls optional. Don't force me to use them. Let the player choose. And then there's the difficulty. Donkey Kong Country Returns is hard. Like, really hard. For a lot of players, this was a welcome challenge, a throwback to the, quote, get good era of gaming. But for others, it felt punishing, especially in later levels where the margin of error became razor thin. And while difficulty is obviously subjective, there is a very fine line between challenging and unfair. And some players felt that Returns occasionally crossed that line, with levels that demanded near perfect precision and timing. But perhaps the most significant hurdle that Returns faced was the very large and inescapable shadow of its predecessors. The original trilogy of games is not just beloved, it's almost sacred. For many fans, Donkey Kong Country is more than a game. It's a formative memory, a core memory, a touchstone of childhood. This meant that Returns was always going to be compared to its predecessors, often unfavorably. The sheer absence of underwater levels, for example, was a very sore spot for longtime fans, because, love them or hate them, those serene swimming stages were a defining part of that original trilogy, and without them, Returns felt sorely incomplete to some players. So, where does that leave Donkey Kong Country Returns? It's a game that dared to take a beloved formula and push it forward. For many, it passed with flying colors and succeeded spectacularly. It revived a dormant franchise, introduced new players to the joys of Donkey Kong, and proved that Retro Studios was one of the most talented and innovative developers working in the industry today. But it's also a game that isn't afraid to challenge its audience, sometimes to a major fault. Whether it is the egregious motion controls, the punishing difficulty, or the absence of certain series staples, Returns is not afraid to ruffle a few feathers. And while I myself really do enjoy Donkey Kong Country Returns, I do find myself alternating between Donkey Kong Country 3 and Returns for my least favorite Donkey Kong Country game. Not because I think they're bad. I think all of these games range from good all the way up to masterpiece, with the first one and Tropical Freeze, and honestly even the second one. I think they're all great. I think they are all very special in their own right, as you have seen in my previous videos leading up to this one. But in the end, Donkey Kong Country Returns, to me, was just very flawed. I really hope that the upcoming Donkey Kong Country Returns HD for the Nintendo Switch, which now releases next month, it's now December, I'm really thinking that the game is going to move up a lot in my placement. The motion controls was by far my biggest problem with the game, and that problem has been fixed. I know as of recently, there have been a lot of videos, a lot of controversy, people on Twitter not being very happy because some of the graphical elements of the game don't look that great. But if I'm being honest, I'm just very happy to have this game in HD on current hardware and add it to my Switch library. I'm ecstatic for that game to come out, and I know, I will admit, it probably is a cash grab. But at the end of the day, having every Donkey Kong Country game on the Switch is very, very special and worth it to me. And I think it's well worth mentioning that Returns was eventually ported to the Nintendo 3DS, which is actually my preferred method of playing the game. Yes, the graphics are not nearly as pretty, though neither game was HD, so the differences were not super big, but it did look quite a bit worse on the 3DS. But it also had bonus levels, and there were no motion controls, so you could map, roll, and smash to a button, and that fixed my biggest problem with the game, therefore making the 3DS version my preferred way to play. Again, both versions of the game are very flawed, hence why I'm so excited for HD. In the end, whether you love it, whether you hate it, objectively, Donkey Kong Country Returns is a statement. A bold, beautiful, and occasionally very frustrating reminder of what makes this franchise so special. It's not perfect. Nowhere near perfect, but maybe that's the point? Like the jungle itself, almost. It's wild, it's untamed, it's full of surprises, and isn't that what made Donkey Kong so special in the first place? Some games demand your attention with massive explosions, dramatic twists, and big, flashy set pieces. And while there's nothing wrong with that, other games quietly draw you in, making you feel like you've stumbled into a world that's always been there, alive, waiting for you to come visit. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is one of those games. It's a platformer, sure, a masterful one at that. But what really sets it apart is the way that it makes you feel. The lush jungles, the icy peaks, and the underwater moments, as divisive as they may be, Tropical Freeze crafts an atmosphere so rich and so alive that it lingers with you long after the credits start to roll. And so today, I wanted to talk about why this game is so special. The art direction, the music, the gameplay, the vibes, everything that makes Tropical Freeze not only one of my favorite 2D platformers, but one of my favorite games of all time. Every great journey starts with a world that is worth exploring, and the world of Tropical Freeze isn't just beautiful, it is quite literally alive. Let's start with the visual design. The environments in this game are so well done, it's quite crazy. You could pause at almost any moment and hang the scene on your wall as a piece of art or a painting. But it's not just about looking good, it's about feeling real. Each level feels like it has its own personality, its own different story to tell. Take Lost Mangroves, the game's opening world. It's not just a jungle, it's a jungle where nature has reclaimed abandoned ships and crashed planes and ruins. There's history here. The vines, the rotting wood, the animals scurrying about, it all gives the sense that this is a place that's existed well before you, and probably will exist long after you as well. And then the underwater levels, which are nothing short of magical. To be fair, water levels are often dreaded in both 2D and 3D platformers, But here, as in most of the Donkey Kong Country franchise, they are a highlight. The way that the coral reefs glow softly in the dim light, the way that the fish move around you, it's mesmerizing. It's a world that feels both tranquil and teeming with life at the same time. Or even look at bright Savannah, where the golden grassland stretches far as you can possibly see, punctuated by dancing trees and herds of grazing animals. It's a celebration of life itself, and that's what makes this world so special feeling. Every environment feels like a character in its own right, with a distinct personality and mood. One of the reasons this world feels so alive is the animation and the graphics. It's a far cry from the original trilogy, with that original trilogy's more darker and more atmospheric vibe, but Donkey Kong and his friends still have that charm. And they don't just move through the levels, they interact with them in ways that make everything feel tactile and grounded. When Donkey Kong rolls through tall grass, it gets shredded and ripples around him. When Dixie Kong uses her ponytail to hover, there's a playful bounce in her movements. Cranky Kong's cane isn't just a tool, it's an extension of his personality, bouncing with a kind of grumpy determination. And though the lack of the Kremlings is still very much felt in this second Returns game, the enemies feel like they belong in this world. The Snowmads invading Donkey Kong Island is a much better premise in my opinion than the Tiki Tak tribe. Even though I don't hate the Tiki Tak tribe, I much prefer the Snowmads. The penguins, the hulking walrus warriors, the owls, they all have animations that make them feel like part of this ecosystem, even though technically they're not. It's a very small detail, but it makes a very big difference. This is not just a platformer. It's a world that you feel like you're a part of. But if it's the visuals that draw you in, it's the music that holds you there. David Wise's soundtrack for Tropical Freeze is unbelievable. As you know, he did not return for Donkey Kong Country Returns. Most of those pieces were just remixes of older pieces from previous games by a different composer, but here, David Wise is back in full force. Each track is a dead perfect match for its level. When you're running through the savannah and grassland groove, the music is jubilant with chanting and percussion that makes you feel like you've stumbled into a festival or onto the set of The Lion King. But then you dive underwater in Abyss Abyss, and the music slows down, becoming ethereal and almost otherworldly, as if you're exploring a world untouched by time. And then there's the boss music. Tracks like Punch Bowl don't just add tension, they drive it. The pounding drums, the soaring brass, it makes every hit, every dodge feel like part of an epic struggle. Wise doesn't just compose music for the moment, he composes it for the emotion, as we've seen before. And that's what makes the soundtrack here so wonderfully unforgettable. Here's the thing. Tropical Freeze does not have a complex story, as most 2D platformers don't. But, in its defense, it doesn't really need one. The Snowmads have invaded, and Donkey Kong and company are fighting to take their home back. That's it. But, the game tells its story through its world. When you see the once lush Donkey Kong Island covered in snow and ice, it's not just an obstacle or something that you have to get around, it's personal. You're taking back your home. You're not just clearing levels, you're reclaiming something that was taken from you. And the game communicates that without a single word of dialogue. It is all in the visuals, the music, and the way that levels are designed. When you finally defeat the Snowmads and the island is restored to its former glory, it feels earned. You didn't just win a game, you restored balance to a world that you have come to care about over these last 10, 12 hours or however long it took you to beat this game. Tropical Freeze is much more than just a sequel. It is a continuation of a legacy, and hopefully not the conclusion of one. It carries the spirit of the original Donkey Kong Country games while carving out its own identity. Retro Studios took everything that made the original trilogy special, the tight platforming, the creative level design, the unforgettable music, and pushed it even further. And they took those complaints that many people, including myself, had about Donkey Kong Country Returns and ran with it. But what makes this game so timeless is its soul. It's not just about precision platforming or creative mechanics, it's about the world that it creates, the feelings that it evokes, and the journey that it takes you on. Tropical Freeze is not just a game that you buy and you play. It's a world that you visit, a story that you feel, and an experience you carry with you. So if you've never played it, or if it's been a while since you last did, do yourself a favor and dive back in. Swing through the jungles, brave the snowstorms, take back your home, and let yourself get lost in one of the most beautifully crafted games ever made. When it comes to Donkey Kong Country, the villains are just as much a part of the series' identity as the Kongs themselves are. King K. Rool, the original antagonist, casts a very long shadow. With his cartoonish flair, his wild costume changes, and his design in general, he's the quintessential video game villain. But in 2014, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze introduced a new kind of foe, one who was quieter, colder, but every bit as menacing: Lord Frederick. As the leader of the Snowmads, Frederick doesn't just attack Donkey Kong and his family, he freezes their entire world. This isn't just a simple theft or personal grudge. It's an invasion on a massive scale, with Frederick acting as both a conqueror and a reflection of the harsh environment the Kongs must now survive. Despite this, Frederick is often dismissed as the poor man's K. Rool or forgettable. This video is going to argue that Frederick is far from a generic stand-in. In fact, to me, he is one of the most thematically cohesive and visually striking villains that Nintendo themselves has ever created. To fully appreciate his character, though, I want to explore his design, his role in the story, his very unique presence, and his unforgettable boss battle at the end of the game. By the end, I hope you'll see why Lord Frederick deserves so much more recognition, not just as a Donkey Kong villain, but as a standout antagonist in gaming. Frederick and the Snowmads make their entrance in the most impactful opening sequence in the entire franchise. The game begins with a celebration. Donkey Kong is enjoying his birthday with his family, a moment of warmth and levity, but that calm is shattered when the Snowmad fleet finally arrive. This isn't a subtle incursion. The Snowmads descend on Donkey Kong Island like a storm, bringing with them an otherworldly cold. Frederick himself signals the invasion by blowing his massive horn, summoning a supernatural blizzard that freezes the entire island in an instant. The bright tropical paradise is transformed into an icy wasteland, setting the stage for the game's journey. This moment establishes Frederick as a different kind of villain. K. Rool's antics are often personal and humorous. He steals bananas, kidnaps friends, and dresses up in silly costumes. But Frederick's approach, by contrast, is colder, both literally and figuratively. His invasion feels calculated, almost impersonal, as though he's asserting dominance simply because he can. The scale of Frederick's ambition is also worth noting. He's not just targeting the Kongs, he's conquering their entire homeland. This sets him apart from many other villains in the series, who often focus on individual acts of revenge or theft. Frederick's goals are grander, making him feel like a true conqueror rather than a petty antagonist. One of my favorite things about Frederick, and what makes him stand out from many other Nintendo villains, is his silence. Unlike K. Rool, who thrives on theatrics and loud expressions, Frederick is very reserved. He doesn't taunt the Kongs or engage in over-the-top antics. Instead, he lets his actions speak for him. His stoicism gives Frederick a unique kind of power. In many ways, his silence mirrors the environment he commands. The icy landscapes of Tropical Freeze are unforgiving and quiet, with an almost eerie stillness. Frederick embodies this tone, making him feel like a natural extension of the world rather than a separate character. However, this is not to say that Frederick lacks personality, not at all. His design, his movements, and actions convey plenty of character. He's very regal and commanding, yet his horn and exaggerated attacks hint at a subtle playfulness. He doesn't need to yell or perform slapstick humor to make an impression. His mere presence is enough to dominate the screen. Frederick's design is one of the most deliberate and cohesive in the entire series. As the leader of the Snowmads, he embodies the Viking aesthetic they all share. His horned helmet, fur cape, and icy blue palette give him a very stoic, warlord-like appearance, someone who should be feared. Choosing a walrus as the villain is an inspired choice for sure. Walruses are massive, powerful creatures, but they're not traditionally seen as threatening. This makes Frederick's transformation into a fearsome conqueror all the more striking. He's both familiar and unexpected, blending natural power with an otherworldly aura. Frederick's design also reinforces the game's themes. Tropical Freeze, at its roots, is a game about survival and adaptation in the face of harsh conditions, and Frederick represents the pinnacle of that harshness. He's not just a character, he is a true manifestation of this invading, cold, unrelenting environment that the Kongs must overcome. Frederick's role as a leader is amplified by the Snowmads, my second favorite enemy faction in the series, after the Kremlings, of course. From their Viking-inspired designs to their icy attacks, the Snowmads feel very unique and like an extension of Frederick himself. Each type of enemy reflects the Snowmad theme. From the mischievous penguins to the burly walruses, this unification makes the Snowmads feel like a real army rather than just a light, random collection of enemies. And as their leader, Frederick feels all the more powerful. He feels like he's in every part of the game even when he's not physically there because of obviously the invading ice and the cold and the snow and the island you have to take back from them. He doesn't just feel like a boss fight. He is the sole reason this army exists and the driving force behind this invasion. At the end of the game, Frederick's boss fight is the culmination of everything that Tropical Freeze has built up to, and is actually my favorite boss fight in the franchise. The battle takes place in a massive icy arena, with Frederick towering over the Kongs. His size and strength are immediately intimidating, but what makes the fight so engaging is how dynamic it is. Frederick's attacks are very different and varied and challenging and unpredictable. He'll summon smaller Snowmad troops, unleash massive ice blasts, and even roll into a ball, bouncing around the arena in a way that forces you to constantly adapt, much like the overarching theme of the story of this game, having to adapt. Each phase of the fight escalates the tension, testing your reflexes and your understanding of the game's mechanics. But what makes this battle so satisfying is how it ties into the game's themes. Just as the Kongs, like I said, have had to endure the harsh conditions that Frederick has imposed on them, the fight requires perseverance and precision to get through it. Defeating him feels like a true triumph, not just over a boss, but over the entire icy world that he represents. So, why doesn't Lord Frederick get the credit that he deserves? Part of it comes down to legacy. K. Rool has been a mainstay of the series since his inception, appearing in multiple games with increasingly elaborate schemes. Frederick, on the other hand, has only appeared in Tropical Freeze. There's also the fact that Frederick's personality is a lot more subtle and more subdued and less extravagant and flamboyant. He doesn't have K. Rool's charm or slapstick charisma, which can make him seem less memorable at first glance, but that completely misses the point of Lord Frederick. Frederick isn't trying to be K. Rool. He's a very different kind of villain. One whose strength lies in his presence alone and thematic cohesion rather than his theatrics. Lord Frederick is, without a doubt, the most underrated villain out of all the Donkey Kong Country games, in my opinion, and it's not even a competition. He may not have the same legacy as K. Rool, but that doesn't make him any less significant. In many ways, he's the perfect villain for Tropical Freeze. He perfectly embodies the game's themes of adaptation, survival, resilience, and overcoming insurmountable odds. Frederick is a conqueror, a leader, and a force of nature. His icy demeanor, his Viking-inspired design, and commanding presence make him one of the most unique villains in this whole series. And I absolutely understand people wanting K. Rool to come back. I want K. Rool to come back. I think if and hopefully when they make Donkey Kong Country 6, they should title it The Return of K. Rool, or K. Rool Returns, or something like that, because bringing him back would truly rejuvenate this franchise and give it a much needed boost. I think the Snowmads are a huge step up in terms of character design and just villain presence over the Tiki Tak tribe, and it just irks me to see how many people hate Frederick just because he is simply not K. Rool. So, I ask you, please, next time you revisit Tropical Freeze, take a moment to appreciate the brilliance that is Lord Frederick. He may not be loud or flashy, but his impact is absolutely undeniable. And in the frosty halls of Tropical Freeze, he truly reigns supreme.